Shooting it raw?
Yes, shooting it raw. So this, let's just say it's more qualitative and less quantitative in the sense that you've got human prosperity plotted against, it's not really clear what the x-axis would be, but so you've
This is
got,
just sort of time through the x-axis, yeah.
okay, so you've got like sort of one area is like tipping point risk with minimal adaptation or failed climate engineering, which is a mouthful, but you're going to explain this. You've got this area which is fossil fuel, and that's the thing about, there's a real phobia or now a kind of this revulsion or this anger or this disgust pushed onto even just the notion of fossil fuel. Yet to have a clear appreciation of the problem, we also need to have a good literacy about how much our societies depend on this easy to access fossil fuel that is quite dirty and it's quite, we're not very efficient at collecting it, but it's certainly pulled us out of the mud. But we've got no climate change, which is one of the arrows. And above that, we have lower cost and less damages. They look less like areas and more like themes or ideas that all sit beneath the very well written out net zero. So please explain, what am I looking at?
So I just wanted to sum up the end message of the book, and this chart kind of gets built up through the book. So we're looking at every aspect of it. So you're coming into this cold, so you're not going to understand certain bits and pieces of it, but we're going to talk through it now.
Sure.
But I think let's first of all start with your point. Sometimes fossil fuels are seen as the enemy. I don't see fossil fuels as the enemy because what we were talking about at the start, we said that for most of human history, your average human basically was no better off for millions of years, up until along came fossil fuels 200 or 300 years ago. And we unlocked this huge energy surplus. It gave us loads of time to improve technology, to build civilization, and to basically establish this enormous knowledge base, this human knowledge base, which has led us to do amazing things. And if you look through this couple of 100-year period, things like life expectancy has doubled, battlefield deaths have declined 20-fold, child mortality, well, that's fallen from 43 to 4%. Extreme poverty is gone from 90% to 10%, right? It's been, by most measures, it's been hugely beneficial for humans as a species. But of course, at the same time, it's putting pressure on the planet.
Yeah.
So I don't see fossil fuels as the enemy. I see them as having given us this opportunity to build our knowledge base. And after doing all this work on the book and figuring out, how exactly can what's it going to cost to solve climate change? How can we do it? You basically realize that we already have nearly everything that we need to solve climate change and avoid the worst warming outcomes, whilst also, by the way, solving air pollution, which is the second biggest killer in the world today. So that's a big co-benefit. But you can do it, and it'll be cheaper than the equivalent fossil fuel system.
Okay.
So, a net zero world will be built around an energy supply that's mainly comes from wind and solar. And because the sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time, what you have to do is connect up different grids and put in some storage. So that's things like batteries or water reservoirs.
Yeah.
But if you look at the cost of wind, solar, batteries, every time that they double in terms of installed sites, the cost of producing them declines by 10 to 35%.
Okay.
So most people look at the cost of climate change just through time and then just put in sort of just guessed assumptions as to what the cost of solar or wind or whatever it might be will be in X year in the future.
Right.
What I realized is that's pointless. What you need to do is say, hey, these costs are going to shrink with scale of production.
Yep.
And once you do it that way, you realize that the end game is going to be cheaper than the fossil fuel equivalent. And so that was really a breakthrough moment for me in this analysis. So, the cost comes down so quickly. And at the same time, when you're supplying all your energy by wind and solar and electricity, you have to electrify everything in the economy. So, like electric cars, electric heat pumps
Yeah.
for houses instead of gas boilers, things like that.
Hmm.
Generally, electric stuff is way more efficient. So you can provide all the same like travel, goods, food, amenities, and you can do it by using half as much energy.
Yeah.
And that energy is getting a lot cheaper because of the scale of production.
Right.
So for me, it became, net zero is a win-win for both the environment, but also the economy.
Um, in your brain, in your intellectual development, in how you got to writing this book and expressing yourself to me is all these little experiences that have been formed by your education and by your sort of just gathering all this information and it just building this expertise in your head, right? So somebody who has zero, not zero, but who has a much, much smaller foundation in the basics that you have may see that gap of like when you say net zero, maybe it's important to also explain what you mean because I understand what you mean, or at least I think I understand what you mean. But what is the vision of that net zero idea or future? Like, how do you see that future?
Yeah. So maybe we need to define net zero first, right? So net zero is essentially means either it means that human emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases which cause global warming, the amount that we're putting into the atmosphere, let's say every year, is offset by a similar amount that we are actively drawing down. So net, it's zero. So
Right.
that could either mean just eliminating all CO2 emissions in the first place, or greenhouse gas emissions in the first place, or it could practically mean reducing those emissions as far as we can, and then finding ways to draw that CO2 back out of the atmosphere so we are net zero.
Okay.
And that means, if you stop adding CO2 to the atmosphere, it stops building up in the atmosphere. It plateaus and eventually it'll start drawing down because of natural processes, and that basically limits global warming to what we hope will be safe levels, which has been deemed by the International Panel on Climate Change at around kind of 1.5 to 2 degrees increase, and we're
Sure.
already just over 1 degree C increase.
Yeah. Like, okay, so in terms of the development of your book, how did so you because you have the experience of writing a book, which is the grand thesis, right? So your PhD
Yeah.
thesis is essentially, okay, I'm going to work on this book for 4 or 5 years, and here it is, present it, well done. Now, as far as this book is concerned, how did it manifest? I know you say, well, I had this, I'm learning about it through my work, but then I decided I want to start articulating it into a kind of a narrative or a kind of a text, right?
Yeah.
So why do you feel that a book is the way to capture that collection of ideas and material?
Um, so for me, how did it come? I guess it came about just so working at the investment bank. Well, my MO became new energy, looking at new energy type things, but also looking at complete integrated kind of supply chains. So what I mean by that is, for instance, if I was looking at battery materials or batteries going into electric cars, I don't just look at that little subset. I look at everything. I look at combustion engines, all of the stuff that's going into building up cars, the whole supply chain, how it all integrates. And I would kind of build these big models and get everybody from around the bank involved,
Hmm.
and then try and figure out the path of the way the world was going to move based on social pressures, based on regulation, based on economics. And that's how I got interested in building these kind of big, what are called integrated models.
Hmm.
Um, but ultimately, I got kind of tired of going sort of head to head with managing directors in the US in oil and gas who would just flat out tell me, no, you can't put that in. Oil demand is never going to peak; it's going to keep growing forever.
Right.
I'm like, well, okay, guys, come on, let's have a conversation about this.
Right. Right.
And so I kind of felt like I'd taken it as far as I could at an investment bank.
Sure.
And I was like, well, I want to do this, but I want to do it on my own. I want it to be my hopefully non-biased view.
Hmm.
And I want to do it for everything. So
Right.
I want the science, the technology, the economics, the politics of everything all mapped together. And
Okay.
that's really what the book was about.
Right.
And you say writing a PhD thesis is hard. That was a walk in the park compared to piecing this book together, right?
Okay. Okay. That's interesting. I think this particular graphic here, which is I'd say the when I see the one of where human prosperity and then net zero and tipping point risk, and in a way there are many things going on in this graphic, right? So what is the one thing people need to remember about this graph?
Yeah. So that line in the middle that says no climate change, right? Imagine
Right.
if climate change didn't exist and human prosperity just kept on increasing through this
Right.
virtuous circle that we talked about first, right? Then let's see the two paths that we could take. Well, we could continue just using fossil fuels,
Okay.
and
Okay.
the system would continue to expand. Um, Maybe we could, if we could successfully engineer the climate.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is there's various options that you could look at in terms of blocking the sun's energy entering Earth using mirrors in space, or making clouds whiter
Yeah.
um, to limit global warming. But they don't solve problems like acidification of the ocean from
Yeah.
more CO2 and things like air pollution, which ultimately comes from burning fossil fuels. But if we were successful, then it would be a little bit worse than there was no climate change.
Mm.
We can also adapt, of course, as it gets warmer. You install more aircon, you create cooling shelters, you can design crops that won't fail so much when there's a drought and things like that. But ultimately, we're going to be worse off because there's a cost to all of these things, no matter how successful they are. But all of these things also run a huge risk. So if we don't adapt properly, or that climate engineering fails, then you have one, you'll be significantly worse off, and that's getting worse, as it goes on. And then you also have these tipping points. So there's physical tipping points. So things where the Earth system just switches really quickly
Yep.
because it's hit a certain threshold. So this is things like monsoon seasons could completely change, within a matter of decades.
Right.
You could see rapid runaway melting of the frozen tundra, which releases even more methane and CO2
Yeah.
greenhouse gases. Breakdown of the Gulf Stream, you see that in climate disaster movies,
Hmm.
which controls a lot of weather around the world. If that breaks down, and then suddenly the weather changes relatively quickly. We're talking
Yeah.
decades. So those are sort of physical tipping points in the climate system, which makes everything way worse than you could predict. And they're kind of, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, they're known unknowns.
Right.
So we know that they happen. We don't quite know at what warming stage they happen. Scientists are trying to figure that out. Then you've also got social tipping points. So remember that this is increasing pressure on lots of subsystems and regions around the world. When does that spill over into mass migration,
Right.
conflict, economic collapse? From an investment banker perspective, and if you listen to Mark Carney talk, he talks about a Minsky moment. So this is when finance isn't based on what happened in the past. It's based on what's going to happen in the future. And that's how you price shares or real estate or whatever it might be.
Right.
And if you suddenly realize that, your condo in Florida has no future, then very quickly that gets devalued.
Yep.
And that can lead to basically a credit crunch moment.
Yeah.
But it would be the carbon crunch. And if you run through the numbers, which I do in the book, it could be 10 times worse than 2009, the credit crunch in
Sure.
2009, because of the huge amount of assets at risk, basically.
Right.
So sticking with fossil fuels, it could be okay if we get lucky, but at some point, probably it gets very bad.
Well, considering that the indications, and from different points in different directions, are that already we're hitting various like reinforcing loops that are just compounding effects that are already, like some would argue, are already showing negative impacts on people's lives. So I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Climate change is already happening. Right?
Sure.
We're already over 1 degree warmer. There's already physical change taking place in terms of sea level rise, extreme weather, and those impacts. Climate change is already happening.
Okay.
We're already over 1 degree C warmer. We're already seeing more extreme weather, be that hurricanes, extreme precipitation, heat waves, forest fires. And we're seeing this gradual sea level rise as well.
Yeah, exactly. So in my excitement to chime in, what I wanted to say was to give you a name. And the name is, this guy's got the best name in the world, Thor Hansen. His name's Thor.
Thor Hansen.
Yeah, so he was on the
Okay.
podcast previously, a few episodes ago, and he's as a scientist trying to sort of show people, well, how is climate changing right now, and how is it manifesting in the biosphere right now?
Yeah.
I'm going to use this moment as a perfect segue to, or just a instant to move on to the last image, which is, I think, a perfect way to promote your book and to promote your ideas. Are you down?
Yeah, let's do it.
So is life really a gift? Really? Can you make every second count? That's the whole point of the podcast. So if you like what you've seen and you're inspired, because that really is my mission, then please give it a like, subscribe, and share.
Shooting it raw?
Yes, shooting it raw.